Hello there and Happy New Year as we enter into 2021 and a new liturgical year. I realise it's been quite a while since I've done a vocations related video, and that's been for a whole host of reasons, not least because of the busyness actually with the various different activities related to hospital chaplaincy and just looking after the stewarding, etc., and those kind of arrangements, reopening for public worship in the parish. But I thought, especially this weekend, the second Sunday of Ordinary Time, especially with the readings from the book of Samuel, which is very much linked with vocation, and in fact in my own vocation story as well, the calling of Samuel really did resonate when I was discerning a vocation. And of course John's Gospel, then the calling of the first apostles who were fundamentally disciples, and what that has to tell us and to teach us about our own quest for encounter with God and our personal relationship with God, and what that means for our own salvation and for our own journey throughout life and our own journey of sanctification. Let's start from the very beginning. The whole history of salvation really starts with the fall, with original sin, at this point at the very beginning of human existence. And the whole history then of the priesthood and the Jewish people, the people of Israel, with this system of sacrifice, of getting it wrong all the time just because of this woundedness, because of original sin, this estrangement from God, and trying to get back into God's favour. That's the whole point really of the Old Testament. And this then paved the way for the cross to help us understand actually what our Lord was doing on the cross as priest and victim, and instituted the sacraments, baptism being the gateway, the first, through then for a Christian, not a life as a customer, but as a disciple. And I'll say what I mean by that shortly. But the whole point then of the Christian life that we enter into as baptism is not to be a passenger, not to be sedentary, as if we were going to church as if it was a cinema, sitting down, watching the show and coming away maybe stirred, but it makes no real difference. We are meant then to engage with those sacraments, with active participation in the liturgy and with our Christian life. And that doesn't mean doing things on the sanctuary. That means an active response to what God is instilling in us through the grace of the sacraments. For a Christian, therefore, the sacraments are there as aids to our sanctification. They are a direct cause of grace, of sanctifying grace in our lives. And they're there at the key moments of our lives. Baptism right at the beginning, or as an adult, the entry into the Christian life. And confirmation, the seal of the Holy Spirit. Reconciliation when we get it wrong, as we will, and we always will. And regular confession and reconciliation is part of that Christian experience, and that growth. There is supposed to be a growth there. Obviously the nourishment of the Eucharist, the sacrament of the sick, not just for the end, but whenever we seriously are ill. And as a hospital chaplain myself, that's a great grace for me as well, to be able to engage with that. And I come away from that constantly being very thankful really for that experience, even if it is at inconvenient times or during the middle of the night. I always come away from that with a great experience and of thankfulness and of value for my own priesthood and for those experiences that I've had from being able to be there at that particularly poignant and powerful time in people's lives at their end of that journey. Of course, the sacraments of vocation, really, of marriage and holy orders, are there for a specific service to the church and ourselves. It's the sacraments of holy orders for us who have holy orders, or for marriage, are there graces to strengthen us and help us to attain our own salvation, but for the service of the church as well. So in priesthood, it's teaching and sanctifying and leading the people of God towards heaven, towards an experience through the sacraments and dispensing the sacraments in all those wonderful ways that I've just mentioned. And marriage, the mutual sanctification of the spouses. Marriage is meant for each of the spouses and the children, then, that openness to children and bringing them up in the Catholic faith is meant for a greater sanctification of the family and therefore of the wider church, which the church is built up of families. Nobody in the church didn't come from a family. So that sanctification of family life leads to the sanctification of society and the greater world. That's the whole point. So our purpose and our identity as human beings is only in relationship with God. We didn't create ourselves, we didn't design ourselves, we didn't give ourselves our own purpose. Modern philosophy has completely lost that understanding, in fact. And when we come to existentialism and similar philosophies, nihilism even worse, there is no acknowledgement of a human nature. But this is utterly at odds with our Christian faith, that we are created, we do have a nature, we all share a human nature which is defined by God, by a creator, a universal human nature that we all share. And that is only really discovered, it's not invented by us, but discovered in relationship with our creator and in response to what he initiates in us through prayer, through various different points in our life where God reveals that to us. And if we decide to invent ourselves, like existentialism and nihilism doesn't even bother, it's just through angst and through turmoil. There is no obvious purpose. But we did not create ourselves, and our fulfillment, our happiness only comes through discerning what our Creator has created us for, and that is to know him and love him and serve him in this life and to be forever happy with him in the next. I always go by the principle that we should listen to people whose lives and lived experience reflects that they've got something right. And with all of these philosophers, all of the philosophers that of the 20th century that I can point to that have embraced some of these nihilistic ideas, look at their lives. Were they happy? Did they find fulfillment? It answers it all. Why should we listen to somebody who never actually found happiness themselves? And when we come to talk about vocation, we can only really give any meaning to vocation, to calling, when we've got the discipleship aspect hammered out first. And again, today's readings from the Gospel of John are a good example of that. It's an encounter with Christ through grace. Obviously the apostles had a personal encounter, and there was something, if you read the Gospels, the first time the apostles came across Christ, there was an immediate reaction, an immediate conversion, the dropping of nets. There was something so charismatic and so incredible about Christ. And that is an encounter that we can have, not a physical encounter, but an encounter through various different ways in our life, but just by listening in the silence to the voice of our heart. We understand what we mean by conscience, and when we know that certain things are right and wrong, we are guided hopefully by a formed conscience. And God can speak to us in different ways. In that respect, the silence, that quiet voice inside ourselves, which calls us no less genuinely, and it's no less real a calling that doesn't come from us. It is from God, and it's if we want to be happy, if we want to be fulfilled, that response has to be a free response to what has already been initiated and instigated by God in us, because that's why we were made. As I say, it's hardwired in our human nature, and that willingness then to follow. And until we realize, as Sherry Waddell, the author, American author, calls it, intentional discipleship, the principle comes from the teaching of the church and the lived experience of all the saints. to say that, yes, I follow you, Lord. And it's a personal thing. We're not following an idea or an abstract concept. We are following God as a personal reality in our lives, and that's a conscious decision. That's what it means to be an intentional disciple. Therefore, from that then, and only until we recognize that we are willing to follow and that we are devoted to and disciples and willing to learn from God, that we can then talk about responding to a vocation. If we don't have an experience of God as a personal reality in our lives, who is calling us? How can we talk about vocation, which means a calling, if we can't answer the question, who is calling us at the personal level? Whatever our state in life, whatever we do, whatever we respond to, whatever Christ wants us to do is always going to be fundamentally better than anything that we've got in mind or planned for ourselves. And we must therefore seek to remove that desire and tendency to try to control every aspect of our own lives, because we cannot follow as a disciple and we cannot follow a vocation if we're constantly trying to control our own lives. We have to let go. We have to put our lives in God's hands and allow him to steer us and trust us. Sometimes it's not going to be exactly the way that we expected, but we have to allow him to guide us and to have that trust that he's got our back. Ultimately, the providence will prevail. I mentioned customer and observer. There's a difference between being a customer, and a Catholic Christian can be a customer. You can come into church, demand to sit in their particular seat and have a comfortable experience of Mass, listen to the readings, go out, and I've experienced it myself, people coming out of church either complaining about something or being very rude about something. And whenever I experience that, it's a very interesting and informative experience, because it's like somebody has just gone to a shop or to any kind of customer services or to a bank or to a cinema, gone there to get their seat, see the show, get what they want out of it, and then leave. And if somebody interrupts their enjoyment of that or their comfort, then they complain. Sometimes the most difficult people I've had to deal with, the people who you never see at Mass, but they come, they want their children baptised, but never come to Mass. And in fact, if you suggest that they should be coming to Mass, they look at you askance. Therefore, they misunderstand what baptism is, of course. Baptism is the entry into a lifelong journey of sanctification. And we get other reasons for people being linked to the institutional aspects of the church, enjoying and getting certain things from it, but again not contributing in various different ways, because it's a customer mentality. What can I get out of this experience? And fine, in some cases it may be about their own salvation, and so there are valid aspects, and a lot of those reasons why customers come to the church are perfectly valid reasons, but they are deficient and impoverished if they are the only reasons for having some kind of contact or relationship with the church. So to become a disciple, it's really expanded in the succession of the Council of Trent. And this lays out the Church's theology of justification in response really to the Reformation and justification by faith alone. And of course, we've got, and in the Catholic understanding of justification, it's all about God's action. It's his initiation, it's his grace and his gift of faith. But in the Catholic doctrine, it's about cooperation. I dislike predestination in any form. I think it's an abhorrent doctrine, I have to say. Especially double predestination, the denial of free will. God, in the teachings of the Church, loves everyone. but we reject him and we are free not to follow him. So he initiates prevenient grace, his invitation to us, and he wants us to respond, and it's entirely up to us whether we do or not. And that should, if we do respond to it and we are open to it, we should, before baptism, especially as adults, we should recognise our need for salvation. We should recognise that there is a problem. And the biggest reason I think why a lot of people don't bother with going to Mass or don't bother with the sacraments is because they don't think anything's wrong. They know that their lives aren't perfect, that they're unhappy somehow, but they fill it up with all sorts of other things, with material possessions or noise or in other things. Go running or go to B&Q instead of praying, and just fill up that emptiness with whatever they can. But for a Christian, the response to grace is to recognise the reality of original sin in our own souls and our own lived experience. There is something wrong. There's a loneliness, there's an isolation, there's an unhappiness, there's a tendency to go against our consciences. There's a weakness there to do the things that we don't want to do and that we know are harmful for us. And a soul which is open and responding to grace recognises that and recognises a need for salvation, a need for a saviour. So the next step then is baptism for a soul that has been evangelised and given that opportunity and that realisation, which is why evangelisation is so important, and so important to do it authentically and not just again as a gimmick. Therefore, baptism then does give us graces, and it opens up gifts of the Spirit as well that we must discern for ourselves, because we've all been given different gifts and talents and charisms which are different from just normal talents, and put them at the service of the mission of the church, which is the salvation of souls. So not just our own salvation, but the salvation of souls. Then from that, all of that dynamic, that openness to grace, which isn't us, it's just allowing God to fill us and allow him to work through us. And that then opens us up to vocation. So a parish, a diocese, a community of faith that is doing that right and is open to all of those graces should be absolutely exploding with vocations of the marriage, vocations to the single life, and vocations to holy orders, to the diaconate and to the priesthood. A parish and diocese that isn't doing that right, is full of customers and not disciples, can't expect to find any vocations coming from it. And that's fundamentally the difference. It's that openness to grace. In Cardiff, we've got many, many gifts, and we are very blessed with the beauty of being in South Wales, and even in current circumstances, we should, and we do have vocations. We are getting vocations from within the diocese. That should be our normal go-to, if you like. That should be our normal source of vocations. We should not be, as a matter of course, importing vocations from other places. A healthy, active diocese should be producing its own vocations from the communities it's going to serve. So let's concentrate, let's have a think, and I invite you to think, because we can all have a tendency to do it sometimes. Am I a customer when it comes to religion? What is my lived experience of a relationship with Christ? What is my experience of prayer? And am I open to putting myself in the hands of God? Or am I more controlling over my life? Do I want to control my life, or am I prepared to open myself to possibilities that I may not have considered, but an invitation from God that is discerned by the church as well, to become more than I ever dreamt I would be? And from my lived experience, I was an engineer, aerospace engineer. I could not 10 years ago have imagined what I'm doing now. And the experience of, as I say, going into hospitals at the very last moments of people's lives. And I remember recently somebody barely conscious, but they, right before they passed away, they were conscious enough after I anointed and absolved them to held out their hand to me in thanks. That was one of the most powerful moments of my priesthood. And that I just cannot imagine 10 years ago even, and how much I've grown and how much I've changed. And just by not always getting it right and getting in the way of grace, but when we get out of the way of grace and just allow ourselves to be led by providence and led by God within the church and guided by the judgment of the church and especially the bishop, then amazing things can happen. So I hope that there are a few ideas that may be of use to bring to prayer and to consider for yourself. God bless you all.